It is perhaps appropriate that the team which leads the way as we enter the third year of the new millennium is a side which has embraced and refined the new professionalism, albeit allied to the traditional virtues of hardness and team spirit, a team which encompasses both the traditional and the modern.
Very effective again, Rod Cafer.
Johnson through, and the dummy, Martin Johnson.
To compete in the Zurich Premiership in the modern era, every player in the side must be of international quality. There is no room for weakness. To guarantee this quality, it is necessary not only to cherry-pick from the best of the Six Nations teams, but also to attract, if you can, the stars of the Southern Hemisphere. Leicester Tigers have now won the Premiership a remarkable 4 years in succession. More than anyone, they embody this new attitude to the game, a far more hard-nosed approach, a necessary evil when faced with the realities of financial survival in a competitive marketplace. But what would the original rugby players have made of these modern rugby mercenaries? How would they have coped with rugby's increasing specialisation, the modern giants of the pack? Every decade has had its great teams, its great players. And of course the changes in the game make it difficult to gauge how the teams compare. Which were the greatest sides? Was it the Southern Hemisphere sides of the early part of the century? The All Black teams of 1905 or 1925? What about the great South African teams from 1906 onwards? They didn't lose a test series until 1956. The arguments go on and on.
South Africa lead by 5 points to 0.
Well, the international sides, I think the one that made the biggest impact on me as a youngster, I suppose, was the 67 All Blacks, who I thought were just moved the game on, and that was a tremendous team. Just as I think then, when you got into the 70s, I think British sides were definitely the best in the world at the time. The 71 Lions, the Welsh team of the 70s, I think was an outstanding team. The 74 Lions, a great team to play in, and the records of these teams over a long period, I think was exceptional. But certainly the Australians team of '84 that came here and did the Grand Slam, I thought was a very good side. And latterly, I think the All Black side that evolved after the '87 World Cup probably played its best rugby in Australia in '88. But that, again, I believe moved the game on to another level. And the Australians of 1991, I think, did as well. So you have teams that I think push the game and move it on each decade.
Rugby by its nature is a game which demands a mixture of courage, athleticism and skill. Grace under pressure, if you like, and certainly it claims one of the most romantic births of any sport. It's a lovely story. In 1823, a 16-year-old boy at rugby school, William Webb Ellis, was playing soccer. Apparently, he either picked up or caught the ball and started to run forward with it, thereby instigating the game of rugby. The truth is more complicated.
In the 1870s, when rugby was exploding nationally, it was the first time that internationals were played. It was really growing as a sport. And the old boys at rugby school decided to look into the history of their game and to find out where and when it started. And they asked all of the old boys from rugby school to write in, giving ideas and memories. And one boy mentioned, he was been a boy at the time, but he was now about 80 years old. And his memory might not have been 100%. He wrote back saying, "My brother can remember being at school with a chap called Webb Ellis who ran with the ball, but I'm not quite sure." And it was all a bit hazy. That was the only name they were given, and that's the reason that the Webb Ellis myth grew. In actual fact, the story is much more interesting. In the 1820s, 1830s, the students at rugby school, the boys, used to play football, as it was known, and they played a game of football which had its own rules, which were made up as they went along to an extent. After each game we hear that the senior boys would actually stand to one side and discuss the game that had been played and decide the rules for the next day. So it was a very flexible game, and it's quite possible that during that period running with the ball was tried. Jem Mackey in the late 1830s, we know for a fact, did run with the ball in his hands, and he actually touched over the goal line, and he was probably the first person to score what we now know as a try. So if anything, he deserves credit for, I mean, it should be the Jem Mackey World Cup, not the Webb Ellis World Cup.
Prior to its evolution at Rugby School, rugby was essentially football, which itself evolved from other earlier activities. It is, of course, almost impossible to be completely accurate about the origins of football, as mankind has been kicking balls or objects around since history began. But where did that mayhem end and an actual game begin? If we look back to China, for instance, we find an ancient Chinese version of football, and the Romans had a version of football called harpastum, which they brought over to the British Isles when they invaded in the 1st century AD.
So that was the first time that football codes came over to Britain, and it fragmented and was played in different forms all around the country. It was basically a rabble of people fighting for a ball. During medieval times, a ball like this would have been used, leather encased with straw or hay or feathers inside it. Archery practice was felt to be very important for national defence, and from the 14th to 17th centuries, football, and indeed most sports, were actually banned because they were taking away people's attention from archery practice.
In pre-industrial Britain, there were traditional encounters between two villages, where one team would endeavour to move a ball from one village, or field, to the next, with the inevitable jollity and injury. But the mass production of the Industrial Revolution demanded that the workforce move into work centres, into towns, and this kind of undisciplined mob mayhem was discouraged. In public schools, games served other purposes. An adolescent's physical energy was channelled into organised activity. Rugby was violent and aggressive, but also controlled. The headmaster at Rugby School, just after the so-called Webb Ellis period, when rugby football was developing rules, was Thomas Arnold.
At the time, you have to remember that all the different public schools played their own version of football. So you had Winchester football, Harrow football, Eton football, and so forth. What Arnold did was he came into Rugby School as headmaster, and he brought a concept with him of muscular Christianity. It involved looking after your fellow man, team spirit, physical contact, hard work, and of course a sound Christian moral upbringing. And it was picked up upon and spread around the country by other public schools. So you had Cheltenham College, Marlborough College picking up on the model and also taking the code of rugby football with them. So Cheltenham College football and Marlborough College football disappeared as rugby football came in. And this is essentially how rugby football spread around the country to the different public schools. Also at Rugby School at the same time you had the schoolboys wearing white, and that's why England wear white. That was picked up upon as a tradition. Also, to differentiate between the different houses as they played against each other at Rugby School, they were awarded coloured caps for their house. And that again is where the idea of getting an international cap derives from. So many of the concepts and the ideas that are currently involved in rugby football derive from Rugby School.
Once the rugby boys left their school and went to university, they sometimes found that other boys from other schools played under other rules. Even today, Winchester School plays its own version of football. This problem had to be addressed.
A chap called Pell in the 1830s was trying to organise football games at Cambridge University. Couldn't do so, found it very difficult because of all these different rules. Therefore in the 1840s, and then more successfully in the 1860s, he wrote a set of rules to be played as national football. These were taken, these Cambridge rules, at the first meeting of the Football Association, which was formed in 1863 in London. They took the Cambridge rules and said, this is the set of rules we're going to use to govern football nationally. At that meeting were representatives from numerous clubs, including Blackheath, who of course are a rugby club as we know them today. Blackheath weren't happy with a couple of aspects of the rules. Hacking and tripping, throttling, they really like to keep. We don't know why, but this is because actually they dropped them a couple of years later from their own rules, so it's a bit of a strange thing. The Football Association were happy to keep running with the ball, but Blackheath were adamant that they wanted to keep hacking and tripping, which the FA didn't want. Blackheath walked out of the meeting, the FA reformed, and they didn't have running with the ball because Blackheath took it with them. If Blackheath had stayed in that meeting, who knows what might have happened. Football, or soccer as we know it now, might include running with the ball in the arms, also the RFU would never have been formed. Rugby would never exist, perhaps.
The rules and even the vocabulary of football tell us a lot about how the game has evolved. Why do rugby players kick the ball over the posts instead of into them? Why are touchdowns called tries?
Initially, the players tried to score a goal from open play. You would kick into the posts from as far away as you could. As you progressed towards a post, sometimes you got to the goal line and you may have to go over the goal line, which made it very difficult to kick into the post, obviously. You would put the ball down, which would give you the opportunity to then try to score a goal. So in early days, in the first England match, 1871, England lost to Scotland by 1 try to 1 try and 1 goal, because we got the try but we missed the goal. So right up to the 1870s, this was the way of scoring. The evolution of the goalposts, it's a bit hazy, but from what we can gather, the goal originally was as other football codes like soccer, whereby you had to go into the goal, you scored the goal into it. At rugby school, they used the junior boys as goalkeepers because it gave them A, a chance to learn the rules of the game, and B, an involvement which didn't involve getting actually in the middle of the melee and getting killed because they were so small. So they would give them the job as being goalkeepers to learn the rules. And it took about 3 months to learn the rules. Because they were goalkeepers, it became very difficult to score goals through the goal. This is what we've been told. And so eventually they changed the rules. It was all very flexible. They changed the rules to go over the bar. That was to score the goal, not into it. It became so difficult to score through all the goalkeepers.
As mentioned, the first Rugby International took place in March 1871, England against Scotland. This was a 20-a-side game. It wasn't until 1875 that the 15-a-side format was adopted at the universities, and another 2 years before it was seen in an international. As rugby developed into more of a passing as opposed to a kicking game, the ball the game was played with also changed. Initially, the size of the ball was dictated by the size of the pig who supplied the bladder. This pig's bladder was then encased in leather. At first, the emphasis was on kicking goals. You scored more points for kicking the goal than the try. At that time, the spherical shape of the bladder suited this rugby kicking game. But as passing developed and back play increased, it was felt important to develop a more streamlined shape.
Now, what happened was that in the 1850s, a chap called Linden was making balls, and he used to employ his wife to inflate the pig's bladders by mouth with a tube. Unfortunately, one day she inhaled by mistake. She contracted an awful lung disease and died. This gave him the impetus to go out and invent a rubber bladder, which could go into the balls. Therefore, by having that, you could regulate the size and also, importantly, the shape. So that's where you get the modern streamlined shape, which everybody wanted to enable them to pass the ball more easily. So you go from the pig's bladder to the rubber bladder.
The Rugby Football Union was formed in 1871. A number of London clubs got together to form an organisation to govern the game, protect its best interests and, of course, field a national side. The game at this time was very popular, especially with the working man in the mills and factories of the north.
For example, the Yorkshire Cup in its early years used to attract more people to watch it, more spectators, than the FA Cup in that time, and also England games played in the south of England at Rugby Union. So you can see there that was the hotbed of the game. Now, to an extent, the RFU, who are London-centric and based in the south, felt a certain, not disgust, but they didn't feel comfortable with the rise of the game in the north because the working class man had more of a need for excitement and victory at all costs and local rivalries, whereas the game as they saw it in the south was more about the Arnold version of the game, muscular Christianity, bettering yourself, good sportsmanship. Victory wasn't to be won at all costs, it was about looking after your fellow man. And they felt there was a certain antagonism between the two codes. This came to a head when it was established in the north, especially with the working man, who had to take time off work on a Saturday to play the game. He was asking his clubs in the north for broken time payment, which meant payment in lieu of hours lost from not being in his factory.
Back in 1893, the Yorkshire Union's request for players to be compensated for broken time caused the first of many rucks off the field. And, as they've done at the end of the 20th century, the first rulers of the RFU allowed this dispute to rumble on for some time, until in 1895, at a meeting at the George Hotel, Huddersfield, 20 clubs from Yorkshire, Lancashire and Cheshire broke away to form the Northern Union. That Northern Union became Rugby League.
Now, There's lots of debate about this. Some people say that it was purely a class struggle, that the RFU wanted to cut off the arm of working class support. Other people will tell you that it's just about money, that they wanted to be purely amateur. I think it's somewhere between the two, because we have got reports of certain London clubs, I think Wasps has been named among them, who actually took tours of Northern England in that time and were paid to travel up north. So in a sense they were flouting the amateur ethos themselves. So really it is probably more to do with a class struggle to an extent than it was purely about payment.
Just as the game had been taken up in the north of England, the same pattern emerged in Wales, but this time the game was harnessed to a national as opposed to a regional or class identity. In 1881 the Welsh Rugby Union was formed, but as opposed to England, rugby became a binding and not a divisive presence. From the late 1880s onwards, the Welsh style of play revitalised rugby, fostering a fluid running game allied to aggressive hard forwards. This was the forerunner of the modern passing game.
Well, Arthur Gould was their big man. He was recognised to be probably the best centre three-quarter in the world. And he was the one who got them moving on the 4-3-quarter line. And they carried all before them. And there was no question that they were the team to beat. In 1905, for example, the New Zealanders came over and beat everybody in sight, except when they went to Cardiff and they were beaten by Wales.
Before that momentous 1905 game, Gould led Wales to their first Triple Crown victory in 1893. This was followed by 6 more between 1900 and 1911. But, in a sense, everything came together in 1905, the All Blacks tour. December the 16th, Wales 3, the All Blacks 0. This team, led by Gwyn Nichols, was a side that accommodated both working class and middle class players, plus immigrant Englishmen. In fact, a team of the future. If Gould was the prime mover in Welsh rugby, Adrian Stoupe was the English Arthur Gould.
But of course there is Adrian Stoupe, who was the captain of the England team against Wales in 1910, and although not generally recognised, is probably responsible for quite a lot of the way the game pattern changed. Well, he picked up on the Welsh idea of playing 4-3-quarters and the interpassing, and it was noticeable that England played very much better after he'd done this than they had before. This is recognised by Harlequins, which was his club, in the fact that they have named their new ground after him, the Stoupe Memorial Ground.
Of course, the rules of the game are constantly evolving. Today's laws would prevent anyone, apart from a specialist forward, from packing down in the front three. But before 1905, anyone who arrived first would form the front row. The technical abilities of players like Federico Mendes would make this an almost criminal offence today, as the power of a Mendes could break a man in two. The game of rugby was taken abroad, to Europe, particularly France, but more importantly to the Southern Hemisphere.
As far as we know, the way that rugby spread around the public schools of England is very similar to the way it spread around the world. This idea of the group play, fighting for each other, the team spirit, it was seen as very important in that period generally. And we know that a lot of the ideas and traditions of rugby school went abroad with it, with the code. So for example, you have the Southern Hemisphere nations awarding caps, just as they awarded caps for schoolhouses in rugby school. However, these things did disappear quite quickly. So by the 1920s, 1930s, caps had disappeared from the Southern Hemisphere and then started awarding blazers, which were obviously much more useful and they weren't so decorative. So the traditions went with the code abroad, but they did slowly disappear as the countries themselves took on their own different traditions.
Even more than in Wales, the game of rugby in New Zealand is seen as a gauge of the nation's strength and standing. Rugby is the sport of the country. It holds incredible importance and has been, in the main, a game of equal opportunity. In the late 19th century, rugby saw Maori playing alongside white New Zealander. The 1888 side that toured Britain was in fact called the Maoris. Only 5 of that side were white New Zealanders. The first official New Zealand tour was in 1905, one of the great sides of that era. Apart from their Welsh experience, they swept all before them, returning home as heroes. As in Wales, the game has become a unifying force, bonding both class and race. So much so that the famous native haka has become a national institution, whites taking on the way of the Maori.
And it's certainly a frightening looking do altogether, isn't it?
After the horror of the Boer War, the 1906 Springboks tour of Britain was almost as successful as that of the 1905 All Blacks. This was the dawn of a long era of dominance. Thereafter, the Springboks didn't lose a test series, either at home or abroad, until 1956. The clashes between the All Blacks and the Springboks became the unofficial championships of the world. The first official test series between the two took place in 1921. This series was drawn, but there had been earlier matches, even if they weren't recognised as internationals by the Rugby Union. In 1916, two forces sides had this contest at Richmond, England, under the watchful eye of the New Zealand High Commissioner, T. Mackenzie. The result of this match has never been uncovered. But rugby in South Africa was a reflection of its society. It was infused with racism. This was a white man's team in a white man's game. In 1919, the same New Zealand Forces team seen here playing Leicester were invited to play in South Africa. They left one of their players, a West Indian, Reggie Wilson, on board ship. Although the game in New Zealand was seemingly free of racism, when it came to choose between international rugby or no international rugby, they bowed to the prejudices of the Springboks. As we have seen, rugby was becoming a global game, and Northern Hemisphere teams have always been keen to test their strength against the sides from the Southern Hemisphere. At the turn of the century, two new sides developed, the famous British Lions and a side which embodied the Corinthian spirit of the game, the Barbarians. The Lions tours have been one of the highlights of world rugby since their inception in 1888, with the first privately arranged tour to Australia and New Zealand. These early tours were populated by players who could afford to take up to 6 months off, university students or the sons of the wealthy.
Well, people who could afford the time and the money. You know, you had to get all sorts of clothes. You had to have white ties and tails and all that sort of thing to go to dances, even in our tour. It was a very expensive thing from our point of view to go at all. A lot of people couldn't afford to go. The married men couldn't afford to go at all. We only had 2 married men on the tour. But, I mean, I was ready to give my job up to go.
1899 was the first tour to contain players from all 4 countries, and 1910 the first tour to represent the 4 home unions officially. Formed in 1890 by a group of Blackheath players, led by William Percy Cartmel, the Barbarians has always existed without a home ground, but has a place